Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a world that's half myth, half memory. Somewhere between candlelight and dream. So, go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights, maybe lie back, and let's take a slow, meandering walk through one of history's oldest heartbreaks. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice. You've probably heard the broad strokes before: a man who loved too much, a mistake made in the dark, and a song so beautiful it nearly changed death itself. But as usual, the details are messier. Because in ancient mythology, love stories rarely end with a wedding and a sunset. They end with snakes, and ghosts, and a fair amount of regrettable harp playing. So let's drift there, to ancient Greece, where everyone seemed to be related to someone divine, and most of them had questionable coping mechanisms. The boy who could charm rocks. Orpheus was born somewhere between legend and nepotism. His father was either Eurydice, a Thracian king with a suspiciously poetic name, or Apollo, the literal god of music and light. Which, if you're keeping score, means Orpheus was either minor royalty or half-divine. Either way, someone who never had to tune his own lyre. From a young age, he was one of those kids. You know the type. The gifted child everyone whispers about at temple festivals. He didn't just play music, he apparently invented sadness as an art form. When Orpheus played, even the rocks stopped rolling down hills to listen. Trees uprooted themselves to get closer. Animals sat in neat little semicircles like an obedient audience of woodland interns. It sounds romantic until you imagine being one of those trees. You've spent 50 years growing in one spot, and now you're expected to waddle off because some teenager discovered emotional ballads. Still, the Greeks loved him for it. He became the archetype of the sensitive artist, centuries before the tortured poets of Paris or the indie guitarists of Brooklyn. Only, in Orpheus's case, he was genuinely talented. And possibly glowed. Eurydice, the girl who walked lightly. Eurydice doesn't get as much attention, which is rather unfair. Most of what we know about her comes through his story, like a faint echo behind his melody. But the poets describe her as gentle, quiet, and beautiful in a way that made bees behave politely around her. Some say she was a dryad, a woodland nymph, meaning she was technically part tree, which might explain why Orpheus's audience found her approachable. Others say she was just human, which somehow makes her tragedy worse. Either way, Orpheus fell for her in the most dramatic way possible. Imagine the scene. He's playing his lyre in the dappled light of some eternally perfect meadow, and she just appears. The breeze pauses. Birds hush mid-song, probably rolling their tiny eyes, because they know what's coming next. Orpheus looks up and instantly decides this is it. The muse, the melody, the point of every song he's ever written. They fall in love. And unlike most mythic couples, they actually seem happy. At least for 5 minutes. The wedding nobody should have attended. Their wedding was one of those occasions the gods simply couldn't resist ruining. All the divine relatives were invited, which was, historically, a mistake. Because Greek gods treated social events the way modern people treat comment sections, as battlegrounds for passive-aggressive chaos. In one telling, Hymen, the god of marriage, and yes, that's really his name, attended. But he arrived late, holding a torch that refused to light properly, which the guests should have taken as a hint. A flickering wedding flame was never a good omen, even in antiquity. Still, the ceremony went on. They exchanged vows, played a little music, and probably tried to ignore the smell of damp torch smoke. And for a brief moment, it looked like Orpheus might actually have a normal, mortal life. But then, as myths go, someone had to die. The snake in the meadow. Not long after the wedding, maybe that same evening, Eurydice wandered off through a meadow. Some versions say she was dancing with her friends. Others say she was fleeing from Aristeus, a shepherd who decided to take pursuit a little too literally. Either way, she stepped on a snake. Because of course she did. And that was that. One bite. One scream. One goddess-level tragedy. The snake, by the way, doesn't get a name. It's just a snake. But in a way, that's fitting. The Greeks loved turning random reptiles into plot devices. Eurydice fell, the color drained from her face, and she was gone before anyone could write a mournful lyric about it. Orpheus found her, or what was left of her, and something inside him simply stopped. Even his lyre went silent. And for a man whose entire existence was built on sound, that silence was the real death. The descent begins. Most people, when they lose someone, visit a grave or write a song. Orpheus did both, and then decided to visit the underworld itself. Because apparently grief and hubris were indistinguishable in ancient Greece. He wandered for days, unshaven, probably smelling like the tragic protagonist of a mythological soap opera, until he reached the entrance to Hades, the realm of the dead. Normally, mortals weren't allowed in. But Orpheus wasn't normal. He had a lyre, and a plan that made absolutely no sense but sounded poetic enough to try. So, he played the music that moved the dead. As his song drifted down into the gloom, something extraordinary happened. The gates of the underworld, normally guarded by Cerberus, a three-headed dog with zero chill, softened. The dog, to everyone's surprise, wagged its tails and sat down. The ghosts paused in their endless wandering. Even the Furies, those terrifying enforcers of vengeance, lowered their whips and listened. And eventually, his music reached Hades and Persephone, the power couple of the underworld. Imagine them sitting on their dark thrones, surrounded by mist, halfway through a tedious eternity, when suddenly, a mortal starts serenading them. Naturally, they were impressed. Not many mortals had the audacity to show up uninvited and turn the afterlife into an acoustic set. Orpheus didn't beg, exactly. He just played his grief, soft, raw, and beautiful. It was the sound of love stretched across the boundary of death. And for once, even the gods listened. The deal. Hades, usually the least sentimental of deities, decided to allow something unprecedented. He would let Eurydice go. But, and there's always a but, on one condition. Orpheus had to lead her out of the underworld himself, walking ahead of her the entire way. He couldn't look back. Not once. If he did, she'd vanish. It was, in essence, a trust exercise designed by a sadist. Orpheus agreed. He began the long climb upward, the faint sound of Eurydice's footsteps trailing behind. Each echo reminding him how fragile the moment was. The path twisted and darkened. The air grew warmer. He could almost sense sunlight above. And yet, he couldn't help himself. The turn. There's something deeply human about doubt. Even the most faithful falter when silence stretches too long. And that's what undid him. At the very threshold of daylight, he turned. Just for a heartbeat. To make sure she was really there. She was. But only for that one instant. Then she faded like mist at dawn, reaching out, too late. And this time, there was no second chance. After the music stopped, Orpheus stumbled out into the world alone. He tried to go back, of course, but the gates were closed to him forever. So he wandered again, through forests and mountains, playing songs that even the stones found hard to bear. Eventually, he gave up on human company altogether. He stopped eating. Stopped speaking. Just played, until the world grew tired of his mourning. Depending on which poet you ask, he either died peacefully, torn apart by jealous women, or, my personal favorite, was struck by lightning for refusing to worship anyone but his lost love. Greek mythology was never subtle. The echo of Orpheus. But his music didn't vanish. The poet said his lyre was lifted into the sky by the muses, transformed into the constellation Lyra. So, in a way, Orpheus still sings. Every clear night, if you look up and squint a little, you can find his song frozen among the stars. And Eurydice? Some say she waits for him still, in a meadow that only exists in dreams. The story lingers because it isn't really about gods or music, it's about doubt. About the way love asks for faith, and how easily we lose it. So as you drift off tonight, remember. Sometimes, even in myth, the most beautiful mistake is simply being human enough to look back. Soft pause. And now, let's drift onward, to another old story where love and fate trip over each other, leaving behind a trail of royal chaos and poetic regret. Hey everyone! welcome back. If you're still awake after the last story, congratulations. If not, that's alright. This one can carry you the rest of the way down. Tonight, we're gliding forward a few thousand years from ancient Greece to the glittering, sun-drenched world of Ptolemaic Egypt. It's a place where royalty wore eyeliner, diplomacy was conducted by seduction, and snakes once again played an unfortunate supporting role. Because, yes, it's time to revisit Cleopatra and Mark Antony. The glamorous, ill-fated power couple of the ancient world. Their story has been told so many times it's practically a lullaby, one with crowns, ships, and a spectacular lack of self-awareness. The queen of 70% makeup tutorials. Cleopatra VII was born in 69 BCE into a dynasty that made family dysfunction a political philosophy. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks ruling over Egypt, which already sounds like the setup to an identity crisis. For generations, they'd kept the bloodline pure, meaning they married almost exclusively within their own family. Sometimes brother to sister. Sometimes uncle to niece. Always ill-advised. By the time Cleopatra arrived, the gene pool was less a pool and more a slightly damp pothole. But despite all odds, she was brilliant. Educated in philosophy, science, and languages, she could reportedly speak 9 of them. Which is 9 more than most kings of her time managed. She wasn't the most beautiful woman alive, no matter what the poets wrote later. But she was charismatic in that quiet, gravitational way. The kind of person who could make you believe treason was a fun group activity. And so, when she finally became queen, after a few predictable civil wars with her siblings, Cleopatra knew she'd need powerful allies. And if they happened to be handsome, well, so much the better. Enter Julius Caesar. Before Mark Antony came along, there was Caesar. Julius Caesar, the Roman general who made empire building look like a particularly enthusiastic hobby. When he arrived in Egypt, he found the country at war with itself. Cleopatra had been exiled by her brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was about 13 years old and already showing signs of weaponized immaturity. Cleopatra, in a move that remains iconic to this day, smuggled herself into Caesar's quarters rolled up in a carpet. Because why simply walk in when you can arrive as a gift-wrapped surprise? Naturally, Caesar was impressed. Not by the logistics, but by the sheer audacity. She was clever, funny, unafraid. And he was powerful, vain, and clearly flattered. The rest wrote itself. They became lovers. He helped her reclaim the throne. And soon, there was a child, Caesarion, whose name was roughly Little Caesar. Yes, just like the pizza chain. But then Caesar was assassinated in Rome, and Cleopatra suddenly found herself without her Roman shield. Which brings us to Act 2. The arrival of Mark Antony. Mark Antony was one of Caesar's closest allies, a general with an impressive resume and an even more impressive ability to make bad decisions look heroic. After Caesar's death, Rome was split between Antony in the east and Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, in the west. They were supposed to cooperate. Naturally, they didn't. Antony needed money, ships, and political backing. Cleopatra had all 3, plus an uncanny ability to make people do things they would later regret. So, in 41 BCE, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus. She could have sent envoys. She could have sent gifts. Instead, she sent a floating theater. The barge scene. It's one of those moments ancient writers adored describing. Cleopatra sailed up the river on a golden barge, its sails perfumed with incense, the air filled with flute music. She was dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, reclining under a canopy of purple silk. Servants fanned her. Silver oars dipped silently in the water. Antony, who had probably been expecting a delegation of accountants, was immediately doomed. The meeting turned into a feast, the feast into a flirtation, and soon the two were inseparable. To everyone else, it looked like a scandal. To them, it felt like destiny. To history, it was an alarm clock that wouldn't stop ringing. A royal romance in Technicolor. Cleopatra and Antony didn't just fall in love, they performed it. They dressed as gods, hosted enormous banquets, and spent money like it was allergic to being saved. They formed a private club called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated entirely to eating, drinking, and doing whatever seemed like a good idea at the time. Antony, when he wasn't feasting, tried to run Roman provinces. He dressed in Egyptian clothes, called himself Dionysus Reborn, and publicly fathered 3 children with Cleopatra. This did not go unnoticed in Rome, where subtlety was still technically a virtue. Octavian, his rival, saw an opportunity. He began whispering that Antony had gone native. That Cleopatra was a dangerous Eastern temptress who had bewitched a good Roman general. The propaganda practically wrote itself. Rome reacts, predictably. By 32 BCE, things were tense. Antony divorced Octavian's sister, which was a diplomatic way of declaring war on the family. Octavian responded by declaring war on Cleopatra, which was the Roman way of declaring war on Antony. The final showdown came at the Battle of Actium. It was supposed to be a decisive naval engagement. Instead, it was a slow-motion disaster. Cleopatra's fleet, elegant but impractical, panicked and retreated mid-battle. Antony, ever the romantic, followed her. The rest of his ships surrendered. When the news reached Rome, Octavian claimed victory and began rewriting history before the ink was even dry. Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Egypt to wait for the inevitable. The end of an empire. A year later, Octavian invaded Egypt. His armies were efficient, merciless, and fully aware of their PR value. Antony tried to rally his forces, but morale had evaporated. When false news reached him that Cleopatra was dead, he fell on his sword, a tragic, if slightly theatrical, gesture. Except, of course, she wasn't dead yet. Cleopatra was brought to him as he lay dying. They had one final, quiet moment together, a farewell framed by all the dust and ruin their love had caused. He died in her arms. And then, finally, she did what she always intended. She joined him. The story says she took her own life with a snake, an ASP, smuggled in a basket of figs. Because symbolism matters. In truth, no one knows exactly how she died. But the legend was too perfect to resist. After the curtain falls, Octavian entered Alexandria in triumph. He found her dead, her attendants faithful to the end, and her empire now his. He admired her, perhaps even pitied her, but not enough to spare her legacy. In Roman history, she became the villain, the seductress who ruined the hero. In later centuries, she became a symbol of beauty, of power, of women who dared to play the same political games as men and lost. But if you look past the propaganda, she was more than that. She was the last pharaoh. A ruler who spoke her people's language, who fought until the last possible moment, who understood that sometimes dignity is the only victory left. And Antony? He was the man who followed love past the edge of reason and found no way back. The silence after power. When you strip away the grandeur, it's the same story as Orpheus and Eurydice, really. A man and a woman reaching across impossible boundaries, love and death, Rome and Egypt, and losing each other in the process. Empires rise and fall, but the pattern stays the same. We build worlds out of longing. We ruin them trying to keep what was never meant to last. So as the lamps burn low tonight, imagine their ships rocking gently on the Nile. The golden barge is empty now, the music fading into the night air. And somewhere, in that quiet between waves, you can almost hear Cleopatra's voice, soft, regretful. Asking, not for pity, but for remembrance. Long pause. Let's drift on, then. Because history has no shortage of beautiful disasters. In the next part, we'll wander into the cold, candlelit courts of Europe, where love, power, and genetics created something even stranger. Hey everyone. Settle back in. Let's dim the lights a little further. Because tonight, we're wandering into the strange, slightly sad world of European royalty, where love was less about passion and more about preserving an increasingly fragile jawline. This is the story of the Habsburgs, a dynasty that ruled most of Europe for centuries, and somehow managed to do it while looking perpetually surprised. The beginning of a beautiful genetic problem. The Habsburgs began as a minor Swiss noble family around the 11th century. Just a few castles, a bit of land, and a healthy sense of ambition. They named themselves after their castle, Habsburg, or Hawk's Castle, which, over time, became simply Habsburg. Their motto might as well have been, "Why fight for power when you can just marry into it?" And to be fair, it worked brilliantly, at first. They didn't conquer, they acquired. Through clever marriages, treaties, and the occasional suspiciously timed death, they expanded their influence from Switzerland to Austria, Spain, Hungary, and beyond. By the 16th century, they were sitting on so many thrones they probably needed a spreadsheet to keep track. But there was a catch. To hold onto their power, they decided it was safest to keep everything in the family. And I mean that, very literally. The cult of cousin marriage. The Habsburgs became Europe's most enthusiastic practitioners of dynastic inbreeding. They believed that marrying outsiders weakened the line, a bold stance for people already struggling to close their mouths properly. Their marriages were a complex web of cousins, uncles, nieces, and occasionally more confusing combinations. By the late 1500s, nearly every Habsburg was related to every other Habsburg in at least two directions. If they'd invented family reunions, they would have been medical conventions. And so, generation by generation, their distinctive look developed. A long lower jaw, drooping lip, and a chin you could almost use as a shelf. Historians now call it the Habsburg jaw, though it might more accurately be described as the Habsburg situation. But to them, it wasn't a flaw, it was a family trait. A sort of noble branding, like a coat of arms, only attached to your skull. Charles V, the emperor who owned everything except his schedule. One of the first great Habsburg emperors was Charles V, born in 1500. By his 20s, he ruled Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and most of the Americas. His empire was so large that people said the sun never set on it. Though, honestly, it probably just got tired and collapsed instead. Charles was serious, devout, and perpetually overwhelmed, which makes sense, since running half the planet while fighting Protestantism is not exactly restful. He also suffered from jaw problems so severe that he couldn't properly chew his food, which may explain why he often looked mildly annoyed in portraits. Imagine being served endless royal banquets you physically can't eat. He eventually abdicated the throne, retired to a monastery, and spent his final years collecting clocks, because apparently timekeeping was easier to manage than ruling the world. The Habsburg family motto, close enough. Charles V divided his empire between his brother and his son, creating two main Habsburg branches: the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish Habsburgs. This was supposed to simplify things. It didn't. Both sides continued marrying each other in increasingly ambitious family configurations. It was like a royal echo chamber. Everyone shared the same ancestors, same jawline, and, increasingly, the same medical charts. By the time we reached the late 1600s, it was clear that the experiment was faltering. And nowhere was that more apparent than in one unfortunate monarch. Charles II of Spain. Charles II, the final boss of inbreeding. Charles II was born in 1661, the son of a marriage between an uncle and his niece. His family tree wasn't just tangled, it was a Mobius strip. He was, genetically, more inbred than the average child of siblings, which is not an accomplishment anyone should strive for. The results were noticeable. He was physically frail, suffered from seizures, couldn't chew properly, and spoke with difficulty due to his massive Habsburg jaw. He was described by courtiers as imbecilic, ghastly, and so ugly it was frightening. Which, for 17th century courtiers, experts at flattery, was practically medical diagnosis. Charles was kind-hearted, though. He tried. He loved animals, believed in miracles, and relied heavily on priests and astrologers who promised him he'd be healed if he just prayed harder. Spoiler, he wasn't. A royal tragedy in slow motion. Charles's reign was essentially one long exercise in hope and futility. He was king in name, but his court was run by factions who used him as a pawn. Foreign ambassadors described him as more a shadow than a king. He couldn't produce an heir, though that was hardly surprising, given that he was, genetically speaking, a copy of a copy of a copy. He spent most of his life ill, convinced he was bewitched. At one point, he had the bodies of his ancestors exhumed to perform exorcisms. Which, understandably, didn't help. By the time he died in 1700, Spain was exhausted, bankrupt, and, most significantly, without a single healthy heir. The Habsburg line in Spain ended with him. Quite literally. The aftermath, and a lesson unlearned. You might think this would have taught Europe a lesson about intermarriage. It didn't. The Austrian Habsburgs kept going for another 2 centuries, producing emperors, empresses, and at least one tragic beauty named Marie Antoinette, who would later lose her head, though by then, at least, the jawline issue had improved. Still, their decline was gentle, almost sleepy, like a candle burning too long in a drafty palace. They'd spent centuries chasing the illusion of divine blood, only to discover that divinity doesn't handle inbreeding very well. A dynasty fades into history. The last true Habsburg emperor, Charles I of Austria, was forced to abdicate in 1918, after World War I. He went into exile, taking with him nothing but a few family relics and an unbroken sense of dignity. He died young, leaving behind a family that still exists today, thankfully, now marrying outside the immediate family. And that's how a dynasty that once ruled continents quietly dissolved into the footnotes of history. No great rebellions, no dramatic executions. Just the slow unraveling of a lineage that forgot how to mix its genes. The gentle echo of power. When you look at portraits of the Habsburgs today, they all seem oddly serene. Wide-eyed, slightly dazed, as if wondering how it all came to this. In a way, their story is oddly comforting. It reminds us that even the mightiest empires can fall victim to the simplest human errors. Fear, pride, and a deep unwillingness to look outside the family dinner table. So as you drift a little closer to sleep tonight, imagine those long corridors of palaces now silent. The tapestries faded, the candles long gone out. And in that hush, the faintest echo of a royal voice, murmuring something between a prayer and a sigh. Perhaps next time, we'll marry someone new. Soft pause. Let's float onward, shall we? Because history, like dreams, never really ends, it just changes costume. In the next part, we'll visit another royal household where power, pride, and bad genetics collided spectacularly. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're staying closer to home, England, 16th century. A place of velvet, candle smoke, and the constant sound of someone being quietly executed for treason. This is the story of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, the royal romance that began with flattery and ended with a sword. It's a tale you probably know, or think you know. But beneath the drama and the stained glass portraits lies something strangely ordinary. 2 people caught between love, vanity, and the heavy machinery of history. The young king and his fairy tale beginning. When Henry VIII first became king in 1509, he was everything a Renaissance monarch was supposed to be. Handsome, athletic, educated. He could ride, joust, compose music, and even write love poetry that wasn't entirely terrible. People adored him. He was the Golden Prince, tall, broad-shouldered, and filled with that particular kind of confidence found only in men who've never been told no. He married Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Spanish royalty, to seal an alliance. She was gracious, intelligent, and pious, a genuinely good queen. And for the first decade or so, they were happy. Or at least, the royal version of happy, polite, dutiful, and attended by several hundred servants. But Henry wanted something Catherine couldn't seem to give him, a son. One healthy, legitimate male heir. Because nothing ruins a monarch's mood quite like the possibility of his cousin taking the throne. Enter Anne Boleyn. And appeared at court sometime around 1522. She wasn't a traditional beauty. The portraits show her with dark eyes, an intelligent face, and a small, sly smile that suggests she knew exactly how much trouble she was about to cause. And had spent years in the French court, learning the arts of flirtation, fashion, and conversational fencing. She wasn't demure, she was magnetic. Men admired her. Women envied her. And Henry, predictably, fell headfirst into fascination. At first, she ignored him. Which, of course, only made things worse. He sent her letters, passionate, rambling letters filled with metaphors about hearts and hunting that might make a modern reader cringe. She kept them. She made him wait. And the longer he waited, the more convinced he became that this was destiny. The great unraveling. There was just one problem: Henry was still married. And the Pope had no intention of undoing that. Marriage, in theory, was sacred, and so were papal decisions. But Henry was not a man used to obstacles. So he decided, rather brilliantly, to declare that the Pope was wrong. That the entire system of religious authority was flawed. That England didn't need Rome to tell it what to do. This was, in essence, the world's most complicated breakup letter. One that ended with the founding of the Church of England. While theologians argued and diplomats panicked, Henry and Anne continued their courtly dance. Their flirtations becoming bolder, their correspondence increasingly desperate. He called her his heart's desire. She called him Your Majesty. A detail that never stopped being a warning sign. The coronation of hope. After years of scheming, Henry finally married Anne in secret, then publicly declared Catherine's marriage invalid. And was crowned Queen of England in 1533, pregnant and radiant, her dark eyes filled with victory. The people, however, were less enthusiastic. Londoners muttered that the new queen was a witch, or worse, French. But Henry was elated. He was sure this child would be the long-awaited son. It wasn't. It was a girl. They named her Elizabeth. And Henry, though momentarily disappointed, reassured himself that sons would follow. They didn't. And miscarried several times. The strain began to show. Henry's affection soured into irritation. He started avoiding her chambers. He found new distractions, among them, a quiet young woman named Jane Seymour. The fall. Court life turned icy. And, sharp-tongued and proud, refused to fade into the background. She quarreled with Henry, mocked his advisors, and earned enemies faster than most people could blink. Whispers grew louder. Rumors of witchcraft, adultery, even incest, all impossible, all convenient. By 1536, Henry had had enough of complexity. He wanted peace, obedience, and Jane Seymour. So his ministers provided a solution. And was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The charges were absurd, the trial a formality. She defended herself with calm intelligence, too calm, perhaps, for a man already convinced of her guilt. On the morning of May 19, 1536, she was led to the scaffold. She wore a gray gown, her hair tucked beneath a simple cap, and walked with the composure of someone who understood that history was watching. Before the sword fell, she said quietly, "I have been faithful to the king, and wish him long life." And that was that. Aftermath. Henry married Jane Seymour 11 days later. He mourned, and briefly, perhaps sincerely, in the way people mourn the version of themselves they've destroyed. Then he moved on. And was erased from court, her initials scraped off palace walls, her portraits hidden. But she left behind something far more enduring than Henry's affection, her daughter, Elizabeth, who would grow into one of England's greatest monarchs. History, as usual, has a quiet sense of irony. The man who couldn't stop falling in love. Henry went on to marry 5 more times, each union more desperate than the last. He wanted love, but he also wanted control. He wanted devotion, but he also wanted to be obeyed. In the end, he found neither. His later portraits show him bloated, sullen, his once athletic body swollen with illness and regret. The Golden Prince had become the weary tyrant, surrounded not by friends, but by flatterers and ghosts. And remained in his memory, though never in his prayers. He once described her as that woman, as though she were a fever he'd finally survived. But it's hard not to think that some nights, just before sleep, he must have remembered her laugh. Her wit, her eyes that saw through him more clearly than anyone else ever had. A quiet reflection. The story of Henry and Anne isn't really about love at all. It's about obsession, ego, and the terrible things people do when they mistake desire for destiny. He wanted immortality through ears. She wanted power through love. And both got exactly what they asked for. Just not in the way they imagined. As you drift tonight, Picture them not as the grand figures in gilded portraits, but as two lonely people at the edge of candlelight, still reaching for something they can't quite name. Because beneath the gold, the crowns, the music, every king and queen was still just human, afraid of being forgotten. Soft pause. Now, let's keep drifting. Because beyond Tudor England lies another court, another cold and glittering tragedy, where beauty was power, and power was a death sentence. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're floating toward 18th century France. A place of chandeliers, powdered wigs, and the faint, distant hum of revolution. Our subject is Marie Antoinette, the Austrian princess who became Queen of France, and who, for better or worse, became the face of everything that went wrong with the monarchy. But before we dive into guillotines and gossip, let's start gently, with a girl who never really asked for any of it. A child of the empire. Marie Antoinette was born in 1755, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. A woman so formidable she could probably negotiate a treaty in her sleep. Marie grew up in palaces filled with marble, Tudors, and the faint terror of disappointing her mother. She was charming but lazy, intelligent but unmotivated. The kind of student who could dazzle the room and forget her Latin homework in the same breath. At 14, she was sent to France to marry the Dauphin, the shy, awkward grandson of Louis XV. His name was Louis Auguste. He would, in time, become Louis XVI. And she, of course, would become legend. But for now, she was a teenager trying not to cry in a carriage. The girl who married a stranger. The French court was everything Vienna wasn't. Colder, stricter, filled with people who judged you by the angle of your curtsy. Marie was expected to be dazzling. She was expected to produce heirs. She was expected, above all, to be French. She managed two of those things. Eventually. Her husband, the Dauphin, was gentle and well-meaning but profoundly uninterested in romance. He preferred locks, keys, and long walks in silence. It would take them 7 years to consummate their marriage. A delay that became the most discussed non-event in Europe. Pamphlets circulated. Caricatures mocked them. And their failure to produce a child became a kind of national obsession. Marie, still barely 20, did what most people do when they feel trapped. She distracted herself. Versailles, a gilded cage. At Versailles, beauty was a weapon and boredom the enemy. Marie Antoinette filled her days with fashion, theater, and the endless social chess game of court life. She danced. She gambled. She laughed too loudly. And she spent a lot. Her gowns were legendary, towering constructions of silk, lace, and architectural ambition. Her hairstyles reached heights that could have their own postal codes. She was young, adored, and desperate to carve out an identity in a world where every move was watched. When her husband finally became king in 1774, she became queen at 19. And for a while, she played the part perfectly. Hosting balls, commissioning portraits, and smiling through the weight of expectation. The private queen. But behind the diamond-studded exterior, Marie longed for simplicity. She built a small retreat on the palace grounds called the Petit Trianon. A sort of dollhouse estate where she could pretend, just for a moment, that she wasn't queen. There, she dressed in simple muslin gowns, tended gardens, and played at being a shepherdess. It was innocent, in its way. But to the people of France, it looked like mockery. While the poor starved, the queen played farmer. And when gossip papers began to circulate, she became their favorite target. They called her Madame Deficit. They accused her of affairs, of indulgence, of being an Austrian spy. None of it mattered if it was true. What mattered was that the people needed someone to blame. A kingdom on the edge. France, by the late 1780s, was broke. Centuries of war, bad harvests, and royal extravagance had gutted the treasury. Louis XVI, kind but indecisive, tried to fix things with half measures and committees. The aristocracy refused to pay taxes. The peasants couldn't. And in Paris, the air grew heavy with anger. The royal family continued to live in their golden cage. believing, or perhaps pretending to believe, that the storm would pass. But storms rarely do. The Fall of Versailles. In October 1789, a mob of thousands, mostly women, marched to Versailles, furious over the price of bread. They carried knives, pikes, and the kind of righteous fury that doesn't wait for protocol. They broke into the palace. They demanded to see the queen. She barely escaped through a hidden passage as guards were killed in the halls. By morning, the royal family was escorted to Paris. No longer rulers, but prisoners. Marie Antoinette never saw Versailles again. The Queen of Sorrows. Life in captivity was a slow unraveling. Her children were taken from her. Her husband was executed in January 1793. And though she tried to remain composed, her letters reveal a woman haunted by guilt and disbelief. The revolutionaries wanted justice, or vengeance, depending on the angle. They accused her of crimes ranging from conspiracy to incest. She denied everything with calm dignity. When she was led to the guillotine in October 1793, she wore a simple white gown. Her hair had turned gray. She apologized to the executioner for stepping on his foot. It was, in the strangest way, her most regal moment. The ghost of Versailles. History has been oddly kind to Marie Antoinette. She's remembered not as the political figure she was, but as a symbol of excess, of beauty, of a doomed world dancing on the edge of ruin. Did she really say, "Let them eat cake"? No. But she might as well have. Because that's what everyone needed her to say. She became a mirror in which a nation saw everything it hated about itself. And in destroying her, they believed they were cleansing the world of vanity. But vanity, of course, doesn't die. It just changes costumes. The soft fade. As we drift away from Versailles, picture her not in a ballroom or before a crowd, but alone in her quiet garden at dusk. The air heavy with lavender. The sound of laughter fading down the paths. For all her faults, she was, in the end, a person out of place. A child of empire dropped into a world that no longer wanted queens. And yet, the legend of Marie Antoinette endures. Because deep down, every age finds its reflection in her. Beautiful, careless, and desperately afraid of change. Soft exhale. Let's float onward now. Out of France, and into a colder, darker empire, where the royal bloodline was both sacred and poisonous. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're traveling to Russia at the turn of the 20th century. To the final days of one of the grandest, strangest dynasties in European history. The Romanovs ruled Russia for over 300 years. They built palaces the size of cities, wore crowns that glittered like small suns, and ruled over millions of people they rarely saw. And at the end of it all, they lost everything. Not in a glorious battle, but in silence, in the dark, while the world turned away. This is the story of Tsar Nicholas II, Empress Alexandra, and their doomed, sheltered family. A family so insulated by wealth and faith that they didn't notice the world collapsing around them. The last Tsar, Nicholas II, was not a bad man. He was, however, an extraordinarily average one. And that was the problem. He loved his wife, his children, his gardens, and his morning coffee. He was polite, devout, and quietly stubborn. But as a ruler, he was misplaced. He inherited the throne in 1894 at age 26. A job he neither wanted nor understood. "I am not prepared to be Tsar," he once said. And unfortunately, history agreed. Still, he tried. He attended meetings, signed decrees, and gave reassuring speeches about divine destiny. All while industrial unrest, famine, and revolution brewed quietly in the background. He believed his crown was sacred. The people, increasingly, believed it was optional. The Empress, Alexandra Fyodorovna, his wife, was a German princess and granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She was intelligent, deeply emotional, and profoundly convinced that her husband was chosen by God. Unfortunately, she was also shy to the point of frostiness. The Russian court found her cold, foreign, and, worst of all, pious. she preferred prayer to politics, silence to ceremony. And when her son, the young Alexei, was born with hemophilia, a disease that made even small injuries potentially fatal, she turned completely inward. Every cut, every bruise could mean death. The Empress lived in constant fear. And in that fear, she reached for faith. Which, as it happens, is where the trouble began. Enter Rasputin. Gregory Rasputin was a wandering mystic from Siberia with piercing eyes and questionable hygiene. He claimed to heal through prayer, and to some extent, he could. When Alexei's bleeding episodes grew life-threatening, Rasputin prayed by the boy's bedside. And somehow, the child improved. To Alexandra, this was divine proof. To everyone else, it was deeply unsettling. Soon, Rasputin became a permanent presence at court. A spiritual advisor with alarming political influence. And the kind of man who thought bathing was optional. Nobles gossiped. Diplomats whispered. Cartoonists drew unflattering illustrations. But Alexandra defended him fiercely. She believed Rasputin was sent by God, which meant that criticizing him was, essentially, blasphemy. Nicholas, exhausted and fond of peace at any cost, chose not to interfere. Naturally, this made everything worse. A kingdom crumbling. By 1914, Europe was a powder keg. And Nicholas, in a decision that can only be described as poorly timed, led Russia into World War I. The country wasn't ready. The army lacked supplies. The people lacked food. And the Tsar, increasingly out of touch, continued to promise victory by the grace of God. Meanwhile, Alexandra and Rasputin effectively ran the government while Nicholas was at the front. It went about as well as you'd expect. Rasputin appointed ministers, dismissed generals, and gave advice that sounded vaguely mystical and entirely disastrous. The empire began to buckle under the weight of incompetence and hunger. And in the freezing streets of Petrograd, revolution simmered. The end of the empire. In February 1917, protests broke out. Not the fiery uprisings of old, but long, weary demonstrations by people who simply couldn't go on. Breadlines turned into marches. Marches turned into riots. The army, sent to suppress the crowds, eventually joined them. By March, the Tsar was forced to abdicate. Not by his enemies, but by his own generals. After 3 centuries, the Romanov dynasty was over. Nicholas and his family were placed under house arrest. First at their palace, then in increasingly remote locations. They still wrote letters. They still prayed. They still believed, somehow, that God would restore them. They were wrong. The long night. In July 1918, in the basement of a house in Ekaterinburg, the last Tsar and his family were awakened in the middle of the night. They were told they were being moved. Nicholas, still dignified, asked for chairs for his daughters. They waited quietly as a firing squad assembled. There were no speeches, no last words. Just the echo of gunfire and the end of a dynasty. It was brutal, senseless, and, in a way, inevitable. The Romanovs had become symbols. And symbols rarely survive revolutions. The ghosts of winter. Today, their story is told with a strange tenderness. People see the family photographs, the daughters in white dresses, the smiling parents, and forget the centuries of autocracy that led to that night. We romanticize them, because tragedy has a way of making tyrants look gentle. But in truth, the Romanovs were neither villains nor saints. They were simply asleep at the wheel of history. A family cocooned in privilege. Unwilling to wake until it was too late. A quiet reflection. It's easy to pity them. To imagine the final candlelight flickering across velvet drapes. The soft prayers whispered into the cold. And maybe they did find peace, in the end. The kind that comes when everything worldly is stripped away. But the empire they left behind, vast, wounded, and restless, would become something even darker. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of marching boots began to echo. Soft pause. Now, let's leave the cold for a moment. We'll let the snow fall behind us. And drift south, to the golden courts of Spain, where power, religion, and madness danced together for generations. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're wandering into the marble corridors of the Habsburg dynasty. That sprawling, glittering, and occasionally unsettling family tree that ruled much of Europe for centuries, and seemed determined to marry only itself. If ever there was a family that took keeping it in the family too seriously, it was the Habsburgs. They believed that royal blood was sacred. And naturally, the best way to preserve sacred blood was to make sure it never met anyone new. The results were visible, especially on their faces. The royal family tree, more like a wreath. At their height, the Habsburgs ruled Spain, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, parts of Italy, and occasionally anything else they could get by strategic marriage. Their motto could have been, "Why fight a war when you can marry a cousin?" Over generations, their family tree began to resemble a knot. Uncles married nieces. Cousins married cousins. And in one memorable case, an uncle married his own great-niece. A move that probably confused even the family priest. This policy kept power concentrated. It also kept genes concentrated. Which brings us to the most famous casualty of all. Charles II of Spain, the final, tragic blossom of this well-watered family vine. Charles II, the last Habsburg. Charles II was born in 1661 to King Philip IV of Spain and his niece, Marianne of Austria. His family had been intermarrying for so long that by the time Charles arrived, his family tree had fewer branches than a broom handle. The results were, sadly, predictable. Charles was sickly from birth. He didn't learn to walk until age 4. Couldn't speak properly until nearly 8. And suffered constant illness and disfigurement. His jaw, that famous Habsburg jaw, jutted so far forward that he couldn't close his mouth completely or chew solid food. Portraits tried to soften it, but even the most flattering artists eventually gave up and painted what they saw. A weary young man with the expression of someone permanently trying to understand why his soup won't stay in the spoon. A kingdom in slow decline. Spain, by then, was a shadow of its former self. The empire had stretched too far, spent too much, and was now ruled by a man barely capable of ruling his own dinner plate. Charles was deeply religious, kind-hearted, and hopelessly dependent on his advisors. His court became a festival of superstition. Priests, astrologers, and healers whispered around him, trying to explain his every ailment as witchcraft or divine punishment. At one point, an exorcism was performed to remove the evil spirits believed to have cursed his body. It did not work, but everyone agreed it was worth a try. Despite his frailty, Charles was married twice. Once to a French princess, and later to a German one. Both unions were childless, which was not exactly surprising. Doctors later concluded that Charles was probably sterile, and that his genetic makeup was so damaged it resembled that of someone born from 2 generations of sibling marriages. Which, in royal terms, was almost true. The end of a bloodline. Charles died in 1700 at the age of 38. After a lifetime of illness, prayer, and bewilderment. His death marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg line. In his will, he named a distant relative, a Bourbon prince, as his heir. This, of course, triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, because no royal death in Europe could ever happen quietly. But in another sense, it was the end of something else. The centuries-long belief that divine right could outweigh basic biology. The Habsburgs had built their empire on the idea of purity. And purity, like all ideals taken too far, eventually turned inward and devoured itself. Faces of the family. If you look at portraits of the Habsburgs over time, you can actually see the evolution, or rather, devolution, play out on canvas. Early Habsburgs were handsome enough. By the 1500s, the jawline had started to assert itself. By the 1600s, it had become the family's defining feature. A physical signature of centuries of careful, disastrous matchmaking. It's almost poetic. A dynasty obsessed with preserving its bloodline ended up breeding itself out of existence. A quiet irony. There's a strange kind of melancholy to the Habsburg story. They weren't monsters. They were products of a system that equated holiness with homogeneity. Each generation inherited not just a crown, but a narrowing horizon. They believed they were chosen by God. And perhaps they were. Though it's difficult to say what, exactly, they were chosen for. Today, scientists study the Habsburgs as a genetic cautionary tale. Historians study them as a political one. And the rest of us can only shake our heads gently. Grateful that modern dating apps at least let you filter for not a first cousin. A softer ending. So let's picture them, for a moment. The candlelit halls of the Escorial. The air heavy with incense and sickness. The royal portraits lining the walls. Each one a little paler than the last. Somewhere in those halls, a young king prays for health. His words slurred by a jaw too heavy for speech. His crown too heavy for comfort. And as the candle flickers out, so too does the dynasty. Soft exhale. Now, let's drift one last time tonight. Out of the Spanish palaces and into the misty fields of medieval England. Where madness wasn't bred, but born on the throne itself. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're staying in England. Where reason, duty, and a touch of royal confusion all met under one unfortunate crown. This is the story of King George III. The man who lost America. Lost his mind. And, in the process, somehow became one of Britain's most tragic and oddly beloved kings. But before we get to the part where he converses politely with oak trees, let's begin where most royal stories begin. With optimism and high expectations. A promising start. George III became king in 1760 at the age of 22. He was tall, tidy, and determined to be a good ruler, which already set him apart from many of his predecessors. Unlike most Hanoverian kings, he was born in England, spoke English as his first language, and genuinely cared about his people. He read deeply, avoided scandal, and kept a rigid daily schedule. Breakfast at 8, correspondence at 9, prayers at noon. He was basically a monarch with a planner. He married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a sensible German princess with a fondness for music and conversation. Their arranged marriage turned into something surprisingly rare for royalty. A genuine love story. They had 15 children, which suggests that the affection was not merely theoretical. For a time, the kingdom seemed stable, prosperous, and blissfully unaware that it was about to lose half its colonies. The American problem. George III saw himself as a father to his people, which, unfortunately, included the American colonies. And like many fathers, he was deeply offended when his children decided they didn't need him anymore. The colonists wanted autonomy. George wanted obedience. He believed he was defending the unity of the empire. They believed he was taxing their tea to death. The result, of course, was the American Revolution. A long, messy family argument that ended with George losing 13 colonies and gaining a lifetime of bad press. Mad King George, they'd later call him. Though, to be fair, the madness came a bit later. At the time, he was just stubborn, which is considerably more common among rulers. The king's mind begins to fray. In the years following America's independence, George continued his diligent, slightly overbearing rule. But around 1788, something began to unravel. His letters grew erratic, long, rambling sentences filled with strange diversions. He spoke rapidly, laughed uncontrollably, and seemed unable to stop talking once he started. Doctors, baffled as always, tried everything. Bleeding, purging, cold baths, and other horrors that passed for medical care. None of it worked. At times, George seemed to recover, only for the symptoms to return. Each episode longer and stranger than the last. He would talk to himself for hours. He would lecture his servants about morality, then weep because the world was sinful. And yes, during one episode, he was seen having a calm, friendly conversation with a tree in Windsor Park, believing it to be the King of Prussia. To his credit, the tree was a very good listener. The private prison. As the episodes worsened, the king's household turned from regal to tragic. He screamed through the night. He babbled prayers for hours. His servants tied him to his bed to stop him from hurting himself. His wife, Queen Charlotte, once the calm center of the royal household, was terrified of him, both for his safety and her own. She visited less and less. His eldest son, the future George IV, was delighted by the opportunity to take power as Prince Regent, a man whose greatest political achievement was maintaining an uninterrupted streak of overindulgence. While his father wandered the gardens in delusion, the prince filled palaces with chandeliers, champagne, and debts large enough to start a small war. It was, in its own grim way, a family tradition. The older generation losing its mind, the younger losing its sense. The diagnosis. Centuries later, scientists revisited George's medical records. Many believe he suffered from porphyria, a genetic disorder that can cause confusion, hallucinations, and pain. It fits the symptoms, though stress, grief, and perhaps a touch of divine irony certainly didn't help. Whatever the cause, his madness came and went like the tide. For brief stretches, he returned to lucidity, apologizing to his doctors and expressing deep shame for the things he couldn't remember saying. In his final years, he was completely blind, deaf, and permanently insane. Kept quietly in Windsor Castle, talking to ghosts, and singing hymns to the God he still believed guided him. He outlived his wife, his sanity, and, to some extent, his own legend. The gentle end. George III died in 1820, after 60 years on the throne, a record at the time. The country that buried him barely resembled the one he'd inherited. He had ruled through revolutions, wars, and the dawn of modern politics. And though history mocked him as mad, his people, perhaps out of pity, remembered him with a surprising fondness. They called him Farmer George, a nickname that hinted at his humility and his lifelong fascination with agriculture. In an age of excess, he was almost wholesome, even when he thought trees could hold a conversation. A quiet reflection. There's something hauntingly human about George III. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't vain. He was just overwhelmed. A decent man trapped inside a system, and later, inside his own mind. His madness stripped away the royal veneer, revealing something rare in monarchs: vulnerability. And maybe that's why his story still lingers. Because beneath the crown, beneath the titles and tragedies, he was, finally, just a man who lost his way. Soft pause, sound of breath. And that, in its quiet, sad way, brings our long, wandering journey through royal dysfunction almost to an end. We've drifted from mythic Greece to medieval England, from Versailles to Vienna, from the cold halls of the Romanovs to the whispering oaks of Windsor. Each story, in its own way, reminds us that history isn't made by heroes or villains, but by people. Fragile, foolish, endlessly complicated people. So as you settle deeper into the night, let these kings and queens fade softly into dreams, their crowns growing faint, their portraits dissolving into candlelight. Because even in the grandest palaces, everyone, eventually, just needs a little rest. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back again. Not to marble palaces or candlelit courts, but to the deep, echoing silence beneath the earth. A place where the air is still, the walls shimmer faintly with gems, and the souls of the dead move like mist. Down there waits Hades, the god no one really wanted to talk about. And up above, sunlight and laughter still belong to Persephone, a girl whose life was changed by a flower. A god. And one very poor decision involving a pomegranate. Let's begin, slowly, with the world before everything went wrong. The earth in bloom. Long ago, before anyone had invented clocks, calendars, or taxes. The earth was always spring. Fields were green, fruit heavy, flowers permanent. And among them wandered Persephone, the daughter of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. Persephone was young, curious, and not particularly aware that being the child of a major goddess came with certain expectations. Her mother adored her, perhaps too much. Demeter followed her everywhere, hovering like a divine helicopter parent, insisting that no one, god or mortal, so much as glance at her daughter the wrong way. Naturally, the entire situation made Persephone feel trapped. She wanted to explore, to see the edges of the world. And, as Greek myths go, that kind of curiosity never ends well. The god below. Meanwhile, far beneath the earth, Hades ruled his realm of shadows. A kingdom without sunlight, without song, and, frankly, without much in the way of social life. Hades wasn't evil, just profoundly isolated. He managed the dead with the efficiency of a civil servant, kept his ghosts in order, and rarely visited Olympus, where his siblings pretended not to notice him. But after a few millennia of managing souls and paperwork, he grew lonely. And then, one day, he looked up through the cracks of the earth and saw Persephone walking in a meadow, light glinting on her hair, hands full of flowers, laughing in the way people only do when they have never yet learned what loss feels like. Something in him broke, or perhaps began. He wanted her, not just as a queen, but as the one bright thing that could make the underworld less empty. The abduction. The story says, Persephone wandered from her friends, drawn to a strange, beautiful flower. When she bent to pluck it, the ground cracked open. A deep, thunderous wound in the earth, and Hades rode out in his chariot of black horses. Before she could scream, he swept her up and disappeared beneath the soil. The earth closed behind them, leaving only the echo of her voice. It was not love. Not yet. It was possession. And it was silence. Above, Demeter heard the cry. And in that single moment, the world began to die. The earth grows cold. Demeter searched the earth for her daughter, calling her name, lighting torches, wandering from temple to temple. When no one answered, she cursed the fields. No grain would grow. No tree would bear fruit. The rivers slowed, and even the animals forgot to breed. Winter, for the first time, came into being. The gods on Olympus grew alarmed. Mortals were starving, temples falling silent. Zeus, who, incidentally, had approved the marriage in secret, suddenly realized the situation was becoming inconvenient. So he sent Hermes, the divine messenger, down into the underworld to negotiate. The queen below. When Hermes found Persephone, she was no longer simply a captive. She sat beside Hades on a dark throne, wearing a crown of obsidian and gold. Her face was calm, not joyous, not resigned, but something in between. There are many versions of what happened next. Some say she had fallen in love with him. Others that she had simply adapted, as so many do when choice is gone. Hermes explained that she could return to her mother, but only if she had eaten nothing in the underworld. And here comes the cruel twist. She had eaten 6 pomegranate seeds. Just a few. A snack, really. But enough to bind her to that realm. The bargain. When Persephone returned, Demeter embraced her in tears. And instantly, the earth bloomed again. Grass sprang up. Flowers burst open. And the rivers ran free. But the joy was short-lived. The fates had made their ruling. For every seed Persephone had eaten, she must spend 1 month of the year with Hades below. 6 seeds. 6 months. And so, the cycle began. When Persephone returned to the underworld each autumn, Demeter mourned, and the earth withered. when she rose again each spring, life returned. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was balance, which is about as close to happiness as Greek mythology ever gets. The quiet meaning beneath the myth, on the surface, is about death and rebirth, about how even the earth must sleep before it can wake again. But there's something softer beneath it, a recognition that light and darkness aren't enemies, but halves of the same whole. Persephone was once only the goddess of flowers. After her abduction, she became the queen of the dead. She learned both sides of existence, life and its absence, and somehow she carried both gracefully. Hades, meanwhile, remains one of mythology's strangest figures. Neither villain nor hero, just a lonely god who mistook desire for destiny. Together, they became an uneasy balance. The rhythm of the seasons, the endless returning, the quiet reminder that even in darkness, something green still waits to grow again. The sleep of the gods. So, as you drift tonight, imagine Persephone's descent. The cool air growing still around her, the sound of the last bird fading, and the first glimmer of firelight in the caverns below. Imagine her walking beside Hades, not captive now, but composed, calm, the very image of acceptance. And somewhere, far above, Demeter watches the snow begin to fall, already counting the days, until the first green shoot breaks through the frost again. Because in every ending, even in myth, there's the promise of return. Soft pause. And that is the tale of Hades and Persephone, the abduction, the bargain, and the eternal compromise between light and shadow. Sleep well, dream deep. And if you're still awake, don't worry. There's always another story waiting beneath the surface. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're staying in ancient Greece. A land full of marble statues, complicated family trees, and gods who never, ever learned to mind their own business. Our story is about Hercules, or Heracles, if we're being proper. The hero everyone thinks they know, muscles, lions, heroic poses. But beneath the myth and the muscles was something much sadder. A man who couldn't stop paying for one bad day. So get comfortable, and let's wander into the long, exhausting life of the strongest man in mythology. Born to trouble, Hercules was born to Zeus, which already meant his life would be messy. Zeus, as usual, had strayed from his marriage, and Hera, his wife, took it as calmly as you'd expect a goddess of marriage to. Which is to say, not calmly at all. The child of her husband's infidelity would not go unpunished. And so, from the moment Hercules was born, Hera decided he would suffer endlessly. As a baby, she sent 2 serpents to strangle him in his crib. He grabbed one in each chubby hand and squeezed until they stopped moving. The nurse fainted. The legend began. He grew into a man of immense strength and very little rest. He wanted peace, family, maybe a bit of wine. But when the gods have chosen you as their favorite cosmic chew toy, peace doesn't last long. The madness. One night, Hera struck again. Not with snakes this time, but with madness. Hercules lost all reason. He thought his wife and children were enemies, and in his confusion, he killed them. When he came to, he found himself standing in the silence of his own destruction. The world around him was still. The gods, as usual, were quiet. He begged for punishment, for a way to atone. The Oracle of Delphi told him to serve King Eurystheus, a petty little man who hated him, and complete whatever tasks the king demanded. 12 labors, each one impossible. A cosmic to-do list designed to break a man. And Hercules said yes. Because in Greek myth, no one ever just takes a nap and rethinks their life choices. Labor 1, the Nemean lion. His first task was to slay the Nemean lion, a beast with golden fur so tough no weapon could pierce it. Hercules tried arrows. They bounced off. He tried a sword. It snapped. Finally, tired and slightly irritated, he wrestled the lion barehanded and strangled it. He skinned it with its own claws, then wore the hide as armor, which, admittedly, is quite the fashion statement. Eurystheus, seeing him return alive, hid in a jar, and that set the tone for their entire working relationship. Labor 2, the Lernaean Hydra. Next came the Hydra, a serpent with many heads, and a nasty habit of growing 2 back for every one you cut off. Hercules waded into the swamp, sword in hand, and immediately realized this was going to take a while. Each time he severed a head, 2 more sprouted. Finally, his nephew Iolaus had an idea. Burn the stumps with fire so they couldn't regrow. It worked. Hercules crushed the immortal final head beneath a rock. But Eurystheus, ever petty, refused to count it, because Hercules had accepted outside help, which, frankly, feels unfair for a man who just decapitated a lizard with a personality disorder. Labor 3, the Ceryneian Hind. The third task was gentler: to capture the sacred deer of Artemis without harming it. For a year, he chased it through forests and mountains, until finally, exhausted, he caught it while it slept. He carried it back carefully, apologizing under his breath to the goddess, because even Hercules knew better than to anger Artemis before breakfast. Labor 4, the Erymanthian Boar. Next, the boar, enormous, violent, and living on a snowy mountain where it chased anything that moved. Hercules waited until winter deepened, then trapped it in the snow and dragged it down alive. When Eurystheus saw it, he screamed, and once again climbed into his jar. A grown man, a king, hiding from livestock. A timeless image of leadership. Labor 5, the Augean Stables. Then came a task that was not dangerous, just disgusting. He was ordered to clean the Augean Stables, which housed thousands of cattle and hadn't been cleaned in decades. Instead of doing it by hand, Hercules rerouted 2 rivers through the stables, washed everything clean, and strolled away whistling. Eurystheus disqualified that one too, declaring it didn't count because Hercules used ingenuity. Apparently, thinking was cheating. Labor 6, the Stymphalian Birds. Next, a flock of man-eating birds with bronze feathers. Hercules used a rattle given by Athena to startle them into the air, then shot them down one by one. By this point, he was more or less operating as a one-man pest control agency. Labor 7, the Cretan Bull. Then came the Cretan Bull, father of the Minotaur, incidentally, which tells you everything you need to know about this family. Hercules wrestled it, tamed it, and brought it back. Eurystheus hid in his jar again. You may detect a theme. Labor 8, the Mares of Diomedes. This one involved man-eating horses, because apparently, Greece had an animal problem. Hercules fed their cruel owner, Diomedes, to his own horses. A very Greek solution, and delivered them safely. The horses were later dedicated to Hera, which feels like an inside joke the mythographers never explained. Labor 9, the Girdle of Hippolyta. Then, the Amazon Queen's girdle. Hippolyta liked Hercules, was willing to give it to him peacefully. But Hera, bored as ever, spread a rumor that Hercules was there to abduct the queen. The Amazons attacked. Hercules fought back, and Hippolyta died in the chaos. So yes, diplomacy, not his strong suit. Labor 10, the Cattle of Geryon. Geryon was a giant with 3 bodies. Hercules killed him, took the cattle, and herded them across half the known world. The journey took years, mostly because the cattle kept wandering off. A relatable problem, even for demigods. Labor 11, the Apples of the Hesperides. Then came the golden apples of Hera's garden, guarded by a dragon. Hercules tricked Atlas, the titan who held up the sky, into retrieving them for him. When Atlas returned and tried to dump the sky on him permanently, Hercules politely asked him to hold it just for a second, then took the apples and left. Classic. Labor 12, Cerberus. Finally, he was told to bring up Cerberus, the three-headed guard dog of the underworld. Hades allowed it, as long as Hercules didn't use weapons. So, of course, he wrestled the dog barehanded, dragged it to the surface, and presented it to a shrieking Eurystheus, who, you guessed it, hid in his jar again. The 12 labors were done. The debts were paid. And Hercules? He was tired. So very tired. The man behind the myth. People remember the strength, but not the sorrow. Hercules spent his life trying to make up for one moment of madness. A mistake forced on him by gods who never had to clean up their own messes. When he finally died, they said Zeus brought him to Olympus and made him immortal, which is another way of saying he finally got to rest. So if you ever feel like life is just one impossible task after another, remember Hercules, the man who did everything right and still had to wrestle a three-headed dog to get closure. Sometimes, the lesson isn't strength, it's endurance. And sometimes, you just shouldn't have answered the oracle's call. Soft exhale. You've been listening to the Sleepless Historian. If your eyes are heavy, that's the point. If not, well, the next myth awaits just beyond the edge of the torchlight. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're sinking into another ancient story. Quiet, shadowed, and full of the strange logic that only myths can have. This is the story of Medusa. You know the version they like to paint. A monster, serpents for hair, eyes that turn men to stone. But beneath the surface, as usual, the truth is gentler, sadder, and far less fair. Because before she was a monster, she was a woman. And as with most women in Greek mythology, that was her first mistake. The girl before the Gorgon. Long before the snakes, Medusa was a mortal priestess of Athena. She was beautiful, the kind of beauty that becomes a liability in myth. Golden hair, clear eyes, and the misfortune of being noticed. Her devotion to Athena was absolute. She served in the temple, sworn to chastity and purity. A rule that, one might note, applied mostly to the priestesses, and never to the gods who wandered in. Then came Poseidon, god of the sea, and professional boundary violator. He saw her in the temple, desired her, and took her, not in a tender way, not in a way that left her any choice. And when Athena discovered this violation of her temple, she didn't punish Poseidon. Of course not. She punished Medusa. The curse. Athena transformed her, twisting her golden hair into serpents, her soft eyes into something sharp and terrible. Her beauty, once envied, became unbearable. No man could look at her and live. It was said that anyone who met her gaze turned to stone. Though perhaps, it was less a curse on them, and more a mercy for her. Medusa fled the world of men, finding refuge at the edge of it, in caverns where even the wind hesitated to enter. She lived in solitude, hunted only when foolish heroes came seeking glory. And so the myth begins to forget she was ever human at all. The hero arrives. Enter Perseus, son of Zeus and a mortal woman, sent to kill her as a convenient errand, because the king who sent him wanted him dead. And fetch me the head of Medusa was an elegant way to achieve that without getting his hands dirty. The gods, as usual, got involved. Athena, always practical, lent him a polished bronze shield. Hermes gave him a curved sword, sharp enough to slice through air. Armed with divine tools and an Olympian sense of self-importance, Perseus set off. He found Medusa sleeping, and rather than risk her gaze, he watched her reflection in the shield, a mirror between himself and the cursed reality of her face. With one swift stroke, he cut off her head. From her blood sprang Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a warrior. Her children, born of Poseidon's assault. Even in death, the gods continued to use her as a vessel. The head that wouldn't die. Perseus carried the head with him, its eyes still alive with their deadly power. He used it as a weapon, turning enemies to stone, displaying it like a trophy. Eventually, he gifted it to Athena. And Athena, in one final act of irony, placed it on her shield. The Aegis, symbol of divine wisdom and protection. The very goddess who had cursed Medusa now wielded her as an ornament of strength. History calls that poetic justice. But to Medusa, it must have felt more like eternal servitude. The quiet truth beneath the myth. Over the centuries, her image shifted. The monster became a symbol. Artists painted her as terrifying, but also strangely serene. A woman who had stopped being anyone's victim. Later writers saw in her something else. Not a creature of evil, but a reflection of fear. The fear of women who refused to be powerless. Her face, they said, wasn't a curse. It was a warning. Because the world, it seems, has always feared a woman who looks back. A modern whisper. Today, people call her tragic, misunderstood, or even heroic. She's appeared in poems, sculptures, even protest banners. Reborn again and again. Not as a monster, but as a mirror. A reminder that sometimes the stories we inherit were never written by the ones who lived them. Medusa never asked to be remembered this way. But perhaps she'd find a small, grim comfort in it. That the face meant to inspire terror now inspires thought instead. The sleep beneath the stone. So, as you drift tonight, imagine the quiet cave by the edge of the sea. The air cool and still. The sound of waves echoing through the stone. There lies Medusa. Not the monster. Not the myth. Just a woman who wanted peace. The snakes rest beside her, their eyes half closed. And for once, no one is coming to look. The sea moves, endlessly, washing away footprints that no longer matter. And somewhere in that darkness, the earth exhales, tired of remembering all the wrong versions of the story. Soft, steady breath. You've been listening to The Sleepless Historian. And if you're still awake, don't worry. There are always more myths waiting. Half forgotten, half true, and entirely human. Welcome back, traveler. Tonight, we're turning the hourglass backward, to the dawn of humankind, when God still walked the earth, and every gift came with a hidden price. This is the story of Pandora, the first woman ever created, and the reason, according to the Greeks, that sorrow, sickness, and sleepless nights entered the world. Or so they said. But as with every myth, the truth is more complicated, and far more interesting. The world before her. In the beginning, the world was, well, mostly fine. Humans had been made by Prometheus, a titan with a rebellious streak. He gave them fire, that precious, golden defiance of the gods. Fire meant warmth, knowledge, and power. It also meant Zeus, king of the gods, was furious. Because mortals, he decided, were getting a little too comfortable. So he planned revenge. Not against Prometheus, but against the humans he loved so much. A gift of punishment. Zeus summoned Hephaestus, the divine blacksmith, and commanded him to sculpt a woman from clay. Every god added something. Athena gave her grace. Aphrodite gave her beauty. Hermes gave her charm and a silver tongue. They called her Pandora, which means all gifted. But gifts from gods are never simple things. Alongside her beauty and wit, they gave her curiosity, the kind that hums softly in the back of your mind and refuses to sleep. And finally, Zeus handed her a jar, a sealed container, heavy and humming with secrets. He smiled, that kind of smile only gods and snakes can manage, and told her one rule: never open it. You can already guess how that went. The man in the jar. Pandora was sent to Earth as a gift to Epimetheus, brother of Prometheus, the god who had stolen fire. Prometheus had warned his brother, never accept gifts from Zeus. But Epimetheus wasn't exactly the sharpest immortal in the box. He took Pandora in gladly. And who could blame him? She was warm, curious, and alive in a world that had never known her kind. For a while, things were perfect. She kept the jar close, pretending she didn't care what was inside. But curiosity, like fire, grows when you try to smother it. The opening. One night, when the air was too quiet, and her thoughts too loud, Pandora approached the jar. Just a peek, she thought. Just a whisper of what's inside. She lifted the lid, and the world changed. Out rushed all the unseen shadows. Pain, sickness, jealousy, death, old age, despair. Creatures with wings of smoke and voices like broken glass. They swirled through the air, escaped into the world, and never returned. Pandora slammed the lid shut, heart pounding. But it was too late. Everything that could make life difficult had already fled into the waiting dark. The last thing in the box. She fell to her knees, tears cutting streaks down her clay-born face. But then she heard it. A faint sound from inside the jar. A voice, soft, trembling, asking to be let out. Pandora hesitated, but slowly opened the lid once more. And out came hope. Tiny, fragile, glowing faintly in the gloom. Hope, the only spirit gentle enough to stay. And so, the story says, though we were given pain and death, we were also given the one thing that lets us bear them. The blame game. Later poets blamed Pandora for all the world's suffering. They called her foolish, vain, disobedient. But if you listen closely, you'll notice something strange. She never created those evils. They were already in the jar, put there by Zeus himself. She didn't curse the world. She revealed it. And maybe that's what the myth was really warning us about. Not the dangers of curiosity, but the price of truth. Because once you open your eyes, you can never unsee what's inside. The whisper before sleep. So, as you drift tonight, imagine her sitting alone beside the jar, watching the last glow of hope flicker in the dark. The world outside hums with new pain, but also with warmth, and fire, and love. Things worth suffering for. Pandora doesn't close the lid again. She lets hope breathe. And in that quiet moment, the first woman in the world finally stops apologizing for being curious. Soft breath, fading music. You've been listening to The Sleepless Historian. If your eyes are still open, don't worry. Tomorrow night, we travel to another myth of love, pride, and wings too close to the sun. Hey everyone. Settle in, let your breathing slow. Maybe dim the lights if you haven't already. Because tonight, we're drifting over the Aegean Sea, where the air smells like salt and old stories. And a boy is about to make the most poetic mistake in history. The labyrinth's shadow. Our story begins not with Icarus, but with his father, Daedalus. Daedalus was an inventor, which in Greek myth usually meant clever enough to impress the gods, and unlucky enough to suffer for it. He designed statues so lifelike they almost breathed, and once built a cow costume, so that a queen could seduce a bull. Because apparently, in Greek mythology, nobody ever said maybe don't. From that disastrous union came the Minotaur, a half-man, half-bull creature that King Minos of Crete found somewhat embarrassing to have wandering his palace halls. So, Daedalus built the labyrinth, a masterpiece of architecture, so complex even its designer could barely find his way out. Unfortunately, the king wasn't exactly good at saying thank you. Instead, he locked Daedalus and his son Icarus inside it. Because of course he did. A father's ingenious escape. You'd think, as the designer of the labyrinth, Daedalus might have included an exit for himself. But hindsight is a cruel architect. Trapped in a maze beneath Crete, Daedalus looked up. The sky, he realized, was the only direction Minos didn't control. And so he began to work. He gathered feathers from the birds above, binding them together with thread and wax. 2 pairs of wings, one for him, one for Icarus. He warned his son gently, his voice echoing in the dim corridors. Fly too low, and the sea's damp air will weigh your wings down. Fly too high, and the sun will melt the wax. Stay in the middle, that was his only rule. And in Greek myths, rules are really just foreshadowing. Taking flight. The morning they escaped, the air was cool, and the ocean gleamed like a sheet of hammered bronze. Daedalus took off first. Steady, graceful, almost godlike in the dawn light. Icarus followed, his laughter carrying over the waves. For a moment, the world below didn't exist. There was no king, no labyrinth, no punishment, only the sky. And who could blame him for wanting a little more of it? The sun, the fall, the silence. They say he flew higher, drawn by that blinding gold warmth. The wax began to soften, the feathers trembled loose, and the air turned from sweet to scorching. Daedalus looked back and saw his son falling. The boy's wings dissolved, and he plunged into the sea, his laughter replaced by the hiss of water swallowing wax. The ocean closed over him, and the waves carried his name, Icarus, whispering it endlessly. Daedalus landed alone on a nearby island, his heart heavier than his inventions. He buried his son and built a temple to Apollo, offering his wings as an apology to the gods, and maybe to himself. The meaning beneath the myth. People usually tell Icarus's story as a warning about pride, disobedience, or youthful arrogance. But that feels too neat. Icarus wasn't punished for arrogance. He just wanted to see what it felt like to be free. And yes, it killed him. But for one shining moment, he saw the world the way the gods did. Some scholars even suggest Daedalus made his wings imperfect on purpose. A secret test of obedience. If that's true, then maybe Icarus didn't fail at all. Maybe he passed in the only way that mattered, by refusing to live half alive, halfway between sky and sea. The endless middle. Daedalus's warning. Stay in the middle. Has echoed through centuries. It's practical, sure, but also deeply human. The middle is safe, predictable, comfortable. But sometimes, our hearts are drawn upward anyway. Toward the sun. Toward something too bright to last. Maybe we burn. Maybe we fall. But for a moment, we fly. And perhaps that's enough. The sea that keeps his name, the place where Icarus fell, was said to be renamed the Icarian Sea. Fishermen whispered his story to the waves, and sailors used it to remind their sons. Don't climb too high. Don't dream too much. But the sea itself, it just keeps shining. Unbothered, endless. Reflecting the same sun that melted his wings. Soft sigh, faint ocean sounds. So if you find yourself dreaming tonight, don't be afraid of the heights. Even if you wake up falling, you'll know what it feels like to fly. You've been listening to The Sleepless Historian. If your eyes are still open, stay with me just a little longer. Next time, we'll wander into another myth of vanity, vengeance, and the most dangerous mirror in the ancient world.